Oh, sorry, I was deep in thought there. I've had to really think about today's 12 days of Amiga ranking worst to best. Anyway, I hope you're doing well. Yeah, so it's number 9, folks. What's going to be in at number 9? Well, I just want to very quickly say that the ranking, or the how I'm ranking these, is explained not only in the very first video in this series, but also in the video description. But very briefly, it's my own ranking. It's not based on anything else. It's based on what the machine was at the time of launch versus what I think of it now, and would I recommend either buying one now or would I buy one now. So that's it. So I thought long and hard about today's entry, and it's come down to this thought. If a system has absolutely zero software for it, or it has less than quality software for it, or less than original software for it, is it still a good system? Not an easy one to answer. So, without further ado, in at number 9, Pop Pickers, is the Amiga CD32. Ow, ow, ow! Ooh. Stop pelting me with rotten fruit. There's no need for that. Gosh, Amiga users can be a bit, finicky at times, can't they? Anyway, yes, I guess you might be expecting something else in at number 9, but its time will come, don't you worry. So yes, so this is how I basically decided this. It was based on that first thought. So what is the Amiga CD32? Well, it's an upgraded, wow, it looks a bit like a Mega Drive, doesn't it? I'm sure that's no coincidence. So essentially, it's a consoleized Amiga 1200 system, and instead of floppy disks, it uses CDs, hence the name of the machine. Quite clever what Commodore did there. Knows no bounds, does it, that company? So, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is my 4th attempt at recording this video. And the reason why it's the 4th attempt is that previous attempts have been too long. So I'm going to just try and cut to the chase. So, what led up to this machine's demise, essentially? Well, between 1985, when Commodore debuted the Amiga technology, and September 1993, when this was launched, Commodore had done precious little to upgrade the custom chips that made an Amiga. So, in late 1992, 7 and a bit years after the original Amiga's launch, they launched the AGA chipset, the Advanced Graphics Architecture, which debuted first in the Amiga 4000 and very shortly afterwards the Amiga 1200. Both personal computer systems, one which was a sort of a wedge design, all in one like an Amiga 500, and one which was a desktop-based PC system. And it was a moderate upgrade. It increased the amount of colours on screen to up to 256 in any of the supported resolutions, and you could go even further with ham-8 mode. This is what this machine contains. The Amiga's sound system and so forth, and other aspects of the system were not upgraded, so this still has the same sound capabilities as the original Amiga. But it does obviously support CD audio, which potentially provides benefits. So yes, this is essentially a consoleized Amiga 1200. It's virtually identical in most respects. It contains 2 megabytes of RAM, a 680 EC20 processor. It has a slightly different arrangement of ports on the back. Obviously, it doesn't include a parallel port, for example. But it does have some unique aspects about it which the 1200 didn't have. First of all, you can see that it has a 4-button plus shoulder buttons controller. A big improvement over a 1-button controller, but sadly saddled with arguably the worst directional pad ever. But by the by, at least we had multiple buttons, but more on that in a minute. We also had an internal expansion port, which was slightly different to the Amiga 1200s, but allowed for future expansions, which I will discuss briefly in this video. And last, it contained a new chip, a Kiko. So what did the Kiko do? Well, basically, she controlled the CD-ROM drive. So this time, Wayne Kerr has been in touch with the show. He writes,
Dear Vicky, really, in 2022, why are you referring to Akiko as she? This is deeply unnecessary and you should be ashamed. Even if it's entirely true that Akiko is almost always a feminine name in Japan. Yours sincerely, W. Kerr.
She merged the functions of two previous chips called the CIAs, the complex interface adapters, and just merged them into this one little chip. But on top of that, Akiko could do chunky to planar graphic conversion. And what that essentially means is it can convert graphics that were stored in a format that was native to, say, a PC or a Macintosh into Amiga format, bit by bit at least anyway. And it was faster to use Akiko to do this than it was to use a CPU. But beyond this is really just an Amiga 1200 with a CD-ROM drive. So the Amiga 1200 was a pretty good home computer, pretty good personal computer. So what makes this number 9 and not the Amiga 1200? Well, it comes down to that first thought, the software. Now, I argued in the Amiga 500 Plus video that Commodore should have been launching a consoleized Amiga in 1989, even early 1990 at the latest. Cartridge-based, maybe not CD-ROM, but they should have been launching that as early as then with upgraded Amiga chipsets. So basically enhanced colours 4 years before this came out, essentially. Now you might say, well, that seems a bit too much, but don't forget that in 1990 the Super Famicom was launched in Japan, so innovation was happening all around the Amiga. So Commodore just really didn't keep up at all. So the other reason why the Amiga 1200 isn't in at number 9 is because by being a computer version of this system, it's just more versatile.
You can tell me, well, actually, I think you'll find that no.
But I have to really focus on this machine's merits as a games console, and remember, I am taking into account the state of the marketplace when this was launched. So, in September 1993, this was really Commodore's desperation move, their last roll of the dice, shall we say, before they filed for liquidation in April of 1994. Now, the writing was appearing on the wall in 1993 for Commodore as a whole. Subsidiaries were being closed across Europe, the German office was scaled down, and in early 1994 the Australian subsidiary also filed for liquidation. So trouble was very much on the horizon for Commodore. They had gone from turning a profit into turning a stonking loss in 1993. So this was launched about a year or so earlier than it should have been, to basically try and get some cash flow into Commodore. And the problem with this is that whilst developers that supported the Amiga had been primed with development machines to create software that would take advantage of the AGA chipset, CD functionality and so forth, by bringing this forwards, they were just unable to say, well look, we finished this, because they just weren't ready. So what happened? Well, basically we got pretty standard fare Amiga ports put onto CDs. Some would say shoveled onto CDs. And some games had literally no changes whatsoever from their floppy disk version. No adaptation to the amount of colours on screen, no adaptation to maybe introduction animations or video or anything like that. No CD audio even, and worse still, no adaptation for the enhanced controller that the CD32 arguably contained. So some games were still using up for jump, for example, and only making use of one button on this controller. That is how bad it was. And the adage goes that the CD32 consisted of Amiga ports. Amiga 500 ports specifically comes up often. And I thought, I'm going to check this out, because that's my recollection too, but I want to make sure that I am being correct rather than just repeating the oft-muttered phrases. And it's true. I looked through those magazines and I looked through the internet to see what was uniquely CD32 software, and I came up with the answer that I already had. This machine mostly consisted of CD versions of games that were available either in years prior to this machine's launch for the Amiga 500 and similar class of machines, or were basically CD32 versions of titles that were being released at the time. And very few of these sadly featured any real CD32 enhancements. Some of them went to the trouble of including CD music, such as James Bond 2, Robocod. Some compiled more than one game onto the same disc, such as the Lotus compilation that came out. But nonetheless, it was mostly games that you could buy for any Amiga system. There was nothing especially unique about what you could buy for the CD32. And the only game that I knew of before I really looked into this, and still remains the only game that I can pull up, is Flink, a Psygnosis platformer that was released around about March of '93.
Well, actually, I think you'll find that
And this was only released for the CD32. It doesn't exist for the 1200 or 4000, and it's a fairly okay platformer as they go. A predecessor to a later game called The Adventures of Lomax, which appeared on the PlayStation some years later. And it was also available for the Mega Drive. Not the Mega CD or Sega CD, the Mega Drive. So the CD32 was getting games that were also available on Sega's, by then, 6-year-old machine, thereabouts. Not looking good, is it? And I have to judge this as a games console because at the same time this was around, obviously people were still frequenting arcades. They were hot. The Japanese were developing amazing new 3D spectacles and so forth, which were going to land on the market in 93, 94 and so forth, leading up eventually to the PlayStations and Sega Saturn's launch in the West in late summer of 95. So the CD32 was very much a case of too little, too late, despite its launch being pulled forward by a whole year or so. So I want to refer to what was happening in the arcades and in the home console scene. So I'm judging this very much as a games console rather than as an Amiga, because that is what this was positioned as. I think in the 80s, particularly in Europe, people were comfortable with their 8-bit micros, wedge-shaped computers with keyboards, and when the Atari ST and Amiga 500 came along, that was a fairly natural upgrade path from all those various machines that people were using across Europe. But as those machines began to age, people who wanted to still continue gaming went one of two directions. They either went towards the direction of consoles such as the Super Nintendo or the Mega Drive, or they went towards the IBM PC compatible market, because that was serving their gaming needs with point-and-click adventures and maybe slightly advanced 3D graphics and so forth in early releases such as Wolfenstein 3D. So the market was already diverging away from where the Amiga had really been able to capitalise on, and certainly outside of Europe, such as in the United States, in Canada and other countries, they had already started making this migration to console-based systems like the NES and to a smaller degree the Master System, well before Europe started moving on to consoles in large quantities. So by 1993, the Super Nintendo was out in Europe, Mega Drive had been out for a number of years as well, and that's what people by and large were buying, as I say. And on there you had first-party developed games. By the time that this came out, you could buy Capcom's Street Fighter II Turbo across all of the regions in the world for your Super Nintendo, and being developed by first-party Capcom, it was fantastic and remains fantastic. And this is a problem that the Amiga suffered from. Because the Amiga is fundamentally a Western computer, it's an American invention essentially, the Japanese really didn't develop for the Amiga or many other Western based or derived computers. They, like many Japanese companies will do even today, that they will focus on the domestic market first. So that would be in the case of the Famicom initially, Konami, Capcom, Hudson Soft and so forth, focused on what was available in Japan, and then that was it really. They just stayed content with developing for largely indigenous, shall we say, systems. And that remained the case when this came out, that all of the arcade ports that we got for the Amiga had to be handled by third parties. And I think most people will agree that most arcade ports of the Amiga don't hold up very well. There are a few exceptions. I mean, GraphGold did a wonderful, if slightly incomplete, conversion of Rainbow Islands for the Amiga. Still remains a game that I will happily play, even though it's missing those extra bonus levels at the end of the game. But we also have the other end of the spectrum, which is where US Gold, Tiertex and Probe Entertainment come into play with dreadful, shoddy ports of games like Strider, Rolling Thunder, Street Fighter 2. And there are many reasons for this. They were often subcontracted out to companies that were starved of the original arcade or consoles graphics, so they had to recreate them from scratch. They were starved of time, money, resources, all sorts of things, and often basically forced to just put out subpar products just because US Gold and so forth were more concerned about getting out on the market and selling a bunch of stuff rather than creating quality. Something that by this stage wasn't happening with first-party releases by and large on the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive. Capcom, Konami, Hudson Soft, Sunsoft, well, Sunsoft was beginning to go off the rails, but Natsume, many other producers were producing really quality titles for the Japanese consoles, and that's what people wanted to play. It would be either ports of arcades such as Street Fighter 2, and latterly we started getting ports of things like Virtua Racing and Daytona USA and so forth for the later 5th generation consoles. That's what people wanted to play, and they just weren't appearing on the Amiga CD32 at all, really. And if they did appear, they were extremely shoddy. I mean, there was a Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo port for the CD32 very late in the day, in the late 1995, and it's awful. In still screenshots it looks the part, but it plays terribly. So unfortunately, as a console, this just completely fails, because it just doesn't offer the gaming experience that people were looking for on a console, essentially. And certainly, if you can't stand up to the 16-bit competition, then what right does this have to say that it's 32-bit power and so forth? I remember Amiga Format reviewing Microcosm, gushing, "It's here at last, the game that justifies the CD32." And they gave it something like 87%, I think, from memory. And then a few issues later, in the editorial, they wrote a grovelling apology. Well, we've paid Microcosm a bit longer, essentially, and it's actually only about 30%. Ugh, that is kind of what was happening. And so yeah, that's ultimately why the CD32 failed. It lacked the quality and depth in its library that made use of some of the enhanced functionality that it had available to itself. It was released too early, but also too late. So it was released early to try and get Commodore some cash flow. And yes, in Christmas 1993, it was the top-selling CD-based system in the UK. But it doesn't really mean much if the software isn't that quality. And of course, that was a smaller proportion of the overall console market. When it comes down to it, we have to look at a game like Donkey Kong Country, or Super Donkey Kong as it is in Japan. This was released in late 94, after Commodore had liquidated in April of 94. And worldwide, it sold 9.4 million copies or thereabouts. And the CD32, they reckon it sold about 100,000 across the whole world by the time Commodore entered liquidation in April of 94. So yeah, basically the CD32 just didn't have the software to compete, and Commodore just put out one shoddy pack after another. Like when it comes to them launching the Dangerous Streets pack and it's going up quality like this, it just stands no chance, does it? It's just basically a complete, foregone conclusion, really, that the CD32 may have been technically able to compete if it had, the right developers and time and so forth to produce stuff. But with the kind of developers that were putting stuff out, it just really wasn't up to the challenge, quite frankly. So yes, a bit of a sad demise for this machine. Too little, too late. So, would I recommend a CD32 these days? Well, if it's only literally to play original CD32 games, no, absolutely not. I just don't think this is worth it. However, you can expand these, as I tentatively mentioned earlier on. Inside of this, just here, is an expansion slot. A little bit different to the Amiga 1200 one, but fundamentally the same idea. Now, first party wise, Commodore did release in very small quantities a full motion video module which allowed MPEG-1 playback, so video CDs and that kind of thing, and ostensibly if a game had MPEG-1 video it would decode it in hardware so it would play smoothly. But aside from that rare as hen's teeth add-on, there is also a range of accelerators, both of the period in the mid-90s, but also modern day ones which add faster processors, extra memory and mass storage interfaces, so whether that is a 2.5-inch spinning hard disk or a compact flash card, and some of them offer external ports for disk drives and all this kind of stuff as well. So you can turn this into an Amiga computer, and from that standpoint, if you want to play games, this makes a very nice compact, well, relatively compact, because these consoles are still quite big, you know, a relatively compact Amiga games machine, and yeah, I don't think that's such a bad idea. But the downside is that these are relatively expensive for really what they do offer. But on the other hand, you could say, well, at least it plays all Amiga games, and yeah, okay, arcade ports in Amiga are, I think if I'm going to be kind, are hit and miss. If I'm to be honest, are mostly rubbish. To be honest with you, I think there are a handful of good arcade ports in Amiga, but mostly where there are okay-ish arcade ports in Amiga, I'd much rather play those either on the Super Nintendo, the Mega Drive, the PC Engine, or even in some cases on the Famicom or NES. I'm sorry, but yeah, Tiertex did that bad a job sometimes. But I think that where the Amiga still shines is in its original productions. So games like Rough and Tumble, you had amazing games like Syndicate, Monkey Island, and Beneath a Steel Sky, and what else did we have? Populous, The Settlers, all these kinds of games, Dune 2. These are games that really play to the Amiga's strengths, and yes, many of these games are also available for other systems, but on an Amiga they offer a fantastic playing experience, and yeah, this will do it. Oh dear, it looks like my Mac battery is low, so I better wrap this up. Let's just close that. So yeah, so that's my evaluation of the Amiga CD32. Yeah, I think some people would have been expecting another system to have slotted in here, and you could argue that that system, which I'm not going to mention just yet anyway, could have arguably caused the problems for this machine, and yeah, I think there's definitely some merit to that. But yeah, there's a reason why I've put that particular model in question just a little bit higher up in the list, so we'll see where it appears relatively soon, I think, and hopefully I'll be able to justify why that machine didn't quite deserve to be in position 9. So that's my reasoning. I just feel that this one is very much weighted by how it was received and produced for at the time of launch. Yeah, so what do you think? Do you agree with my assessment of the Amiga CD32? Do you think I'm bang out wrong and need to be put in my place with all the facts to say that, yes, the Amiga CD32 was excellent because it was really good playing Arabian Nights or something like that? And who needed a port of Mortal Kombat anyway for the CD32 at the time? And stuff like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm overemphasising stuff now. But yes, I'd love to hear what you think about my assessment in the comments down below. Yeah, so that's pretty much about it, really. I hope that gives a slightly interesting look at why I feel the CD32 is not particularly high up in my list. A lot of people often just mention A500 shovelware, but neglect to mention some of the things that were happening outside of the market. At the end of the day, people wanted to play games like Street Fighter 2 Turbo, they wanted to play Contra, they wanted to play... what else would they have wanted to play? Things like Secret of Mana, because we actually did get that in the West. They wanted to play things like Phantasy Star. They wanted to play games like... dear me, why is it when I ever put on a spot that I basically forget a whole bunch of games? They wanted to play things like Star Fox or Star Wing, as it was in much of Europe. So, yeah, you know, like... And also, like, I know Aladdin did come out for the Amiga, but it never came out for the CD32, and that was one of the biggest selling games of 1993. Yeah, it just really wasn't working for this system, was it? Anyway, I've laboured the point enough. That's why I've put the CD32 here. You can tell me I'm wrong down below. You can agree with me below. I'd love to hear what you've got to say. Anyway, that's all for me. I guess that all remains for me to say is see you soon. Peace!